In the spring of 1946, Orla Denning, a 61-year-old widow with 40 acres of blossoming apple trees on a shelf of ground above the Kettle Valley, paid $40 in loose bills for a rusted war surplus aircraft engine and a bent wooden propeller that the whole of Ashford County had already written off as a fool's pile of scrap. And by the time the loafers down at the feed store in town had finished laughing about it, they had a name for her. They called her the Windmill Widow, and they laughed about it for the better part of 2 years, right up until the killing frost of 1947 came down over the valley in the dead dark before dawn and turned every blossoming orchard for 11 miles to black ruin. Every orchard but hers. She had not lost her wits in her grief. She had read a thing in a dead flyer's letter that not one of those men had ever bothered to learn. She was a lean, upright woman, tall for her age, with a spine that had never learned to stoop even after the years earned her the right. Her face was a map of weather. Deep lines cut from the corners of her eyes down across cheeks, gone chapped and ruddy from a lifetime standing in wind. She wore a canvas coat the color of wet sand, worn pale at the elbows, and a headscarf knotted under her chin in the old manner her mother had used. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had picked 40 seasons of apples, the knuckles swollen and shining, the palms hard as saddle leather. When she walked her rows in the gray light, she walked slow, one gloved hand trailing along the low branches, and the trees seemed to lean toward her the way a dog leans toward the one who feeds it. Her husband had been a quiet man named Corwin Denning, and he had planted the first of those apple trees the year they married. And he had died in the winter of 1944 with his boots still by the stove. They had lost their only son over the water in the last full year of the war, a tail gunner in a heavy bomber, a boy who had grown up in those rows and gone off to a sky full of engines and had not come back. So Orla was alone on the shelf with 40 acres of trees her husband had planted and a grief she carried upright and without complaint. Now everyone in Ashford County knew a plain and simple thing about apples, and the thing they knew was this: frost at blossom was the hand of God, and there was not one blessed thing a farmer could do about it but pray and count his losses in the morning. When the cold came down in late April and settled over the low ground, it killed the open flowers, and no flower meant no fruit, and no fruit meant no year. The old men had smudged their orchards with oil pots and burning tires and wet straw for as long as anyone could remember, filling the night with stinking smoke, and half the time it did nothing at all and cost them a fortune in oil besides. That was simply how it was. A man planted, and a man hoped, and a man took what the spring frost left him. Anyone who told you different was selling something. So when the widow Denning drove her old flatbed down to the surplus yard by the rail siding that spring and paid $40 for a dead engine off a scrapped bomber, the whole notion of it struck the county as the saddest kind of foolishness. What those idle men in town did not know, what not one of them had the patience to learn, was already written down in a dead man's hand, folded into a letter she kept in the breast pocket of that canvas coat, close against her heart. If you have ever watched a whole town decide that a steady, capable person had gone soft in her sorrow, or been the one they decided that about yourself, then you already understand why a story like this one needs telling. Stay with Orla. It is worth the staying. The letter had come from her son, written in the last spring of his life, in a careful hand on thin paper that had crossed an ocean to reach her. He wrote of the cold at altitude, of how a bomber climbed up through layers of air, and of a thing the crews all knew, that some nights the air near the ground was colder than the air above it, and a plane rising would pass out of the frozen ground layer into a band of air that was warmer higher up. He called it the inversion. He wrote that on the worst cold mornings the warm air sat up there like a lid over the cold, and if a man could only reach up and pull that warm lid down, he could beat the frost. He had meant it as a wonder, a strange fact from a boy's new world of sky and engines, something to share with the mother who had taught him to watch weather. He could not have known she would read it 40 times by lamplight after he was gone, or that she would come to see in those few lines a way to save the trees his father had planted. For the truth of it, the thing the Flyers crews knew, and the orchard men did not, was that on the stillest, coldest, most dangerous nights, the killing frost only settled when the air lay dead and unmoving, letting the cold sink and pool along the ground while the warmth rose away out of reach. Stir that air, drag the warm band down, and mix it through the cold, and the frost could not set. All a body needed was wind on a windless night, a great deal of wind made by main force, aimed down at the trees, and an aircraft engine with a propeller was nothing in the world but a machine built to make wind. She told none of that to the men who gathered at the store. She let them laugh. Through the summer of 1946, she worked at her strange machine as she worked at everything else, slow and without complaint and without an audience. She hired a young mechanic named Petey Halloran, a boy back from the Pacific with a limp and a gift for engines and no work to be found, and she paid him in cash and apple butter and the first respect anyone had shown him since he came home. The two of them raised a tower of creosoted timber in the middle of the orchard up near the crown of the shelf where the ground fell away on 3 sides. They mounted the great radial engine at the top of it, and they hung the bent propeller, and Petey straightened the blade over a bed of coals and shaped it true again, and they rigged a fuel drum and a hand crank and a set of controls a woman could reach from a wooden platform. The whole county came to look, some Sundays, the way people come to look at a barn fire. They parked along the road below the shelf and stood at her fence line and pointed up at the thing on its tower against the sky, and they laughed. A retired orchardist named Ellery Voss, who owned the big spread down in the bottom land and had wanted the widow's shelf ground for 30 years because the cold air drained off it so clean, laughed the loudest. He was a heavy, patient, smiling man with a way of laughing at a thing that made it sound like kindness, and it was not kindness. He told the men at the store that the poor woman had bolted an airplane to a stick, and that when the bank finally took her 40 acres, he would leave the funny old windmill standing as a monument to what grief does to a sensible mind. But there was one who did not laugh. Ellery Voss had a wife named Dorothea, a small and quiet woman with a straight back of her own, and one evening when he was going on at the supper table about the windmill widow and her airplane on a stick, Dorothea set down her fork and looked at him across the table and said one word, "Ellery." That was all. Just his name, laid down flat and plain as a stone on a grave. He set down his own fork and looked at her, and she went on, quiet and steady. That woman buried her husband and her only boy inside of 2 years, Dorothea said, and she gets up every morning and works her rows. You will not sit at my table and call her soft in the head. You will go up there tomorrow, and you will ask her, like a neighbor, what it is she is building. She bolted an airplane to a stick, Dorothea, he said. "Then it is the first stick in this valley you have ever been afraid of," she said, and she rose and cleared the plates. And Ellery Voss stopped his laughing for that one evening, though he took it up again the next morning down at the store, for a man like that cannot hold his shame long against the pull of his own wanting. The daily work of it was hard and thankless and mostly invisible. All through the second summer, Petey Halloran tore the engine down and built it up again 3 separate times, learning its temper, for a machine built to fly a few hundred hours and be discarded was never meant to sit in the weather and start on a cold morning at the pull of a crank. Orla walked her rows at dawn as she always had, but now with a mind turned to the sky. Watching how the coal pooled in the low corner of the orchard, marking with stakes where the frost sat heaviest, learning her own ground as a general learns a field before a battle he knows is coming. She kept the flyer's letter in her breast pocket, and she read it on the hard nights, and she wrote her own notes in a ledger bound in oilcloth, temperatures and wind and the hour the cold came. Building a book of her ground that no one else in the valley had ever thought to keep. The stakes were not small, and she never pretended they were. There was a note against the 40 acres at the bank, taken out to bury her husband and buy the surplus engine besides, and a year with no apple crop would put her behind it. And 2 such years would put Ellery Voss and his patient smile at her fence with a paper in his hand. She knew it. She wrote the numbers down in her ledger, and she would not let the numbers turn her. There came a night in the second spring, in the late cold snap of April 1947, a full week before the trees were even in bloom, when she and Petey ran the engine for the first true test, and it failed her. It coughed and caught and ran ragged for perhaps 4 minutes, throwing a great roaring whine down across the dark orchard so that the young leaves lay flat and silver in the starlight, and then it seized with a shriek of tortured metal and a gout of black smoke and went dead and silent. And a smell of scorched oil hung over the trees. Petey climbed the tower in the cold with a lantern and came down after an hour with his face gray, and he told her the bearing had gone, the main bearing, the one part he could not shape himself, and that a new one would cost money she did not have, and would have to come by rail from the coast and might take 3 weeks to arrive. That was the night Orla Denning came the closest she ever came to selling. Ellery Voss had left word twice that spring through the man at the store that his offer for the shelf ground still stood and was fair and would not stand forever. She sat at her kitchen table that night with the lamp low and the dead flyer's letter unfolded on the oilcloth and the banknote beside it. And a hard practical voice in her told her that a sensible woman of 61 did not bolt her whole future to a scrapped airplane, that grief had perhaps softened her after all, that she should take Ellery's money and his patient's smile and be done with it and live out her years in town. She sat there a long while. Then she folded the letter back into her breast pocket, and she took up a pencil. And instead of writing to the bank, she wrote in the oilcloth book the number of the bearing off the engine plate, and under it she wrote a single line, "Send for it in the morning, and pray the frost holds off 3 weeks." She had chosen the machine one more time in the dark. The bearing came by rail in 17 days, and Petey set it in a single long night by lantern light. His bad leg braced against the tower, and on the 18th day the engine ran clean and true for a full hour and threw its warm wine down over the orchard, and the trees on the shelf came into bloom 3 days after, every branch gone white and pink and humming with bees, the finest bloom the widow had ever seen on her husband's trees. And down in the bottomland, Ellery Voss's orchard bloomed too, and every other orchard in the valley, mile on mile of white blossom under the April sky, and the whole county forgot the windmill widow for a season and turned its mind to the harvest that a good bloom promised. And the loafers at the store agreed it looked to be the best apple year in a decade. Then, on the last night of April in 1947, the sky went dead clear, and the wind died to nothing, and the stars came out hard and close, and the old orchard men who knew weather felt the cold coming down and knew they could do nothing but light their smudge pots and pray. It was a radiation frost, the worst kind. The kind that comes on a still, clear night when the ground gives up all its warmth to the empty sky and the cold air sinks and pools and lies unmoving over the low land. By midnight, the thermometers set out across the low ground were falling past the mark where an open blossom dies, and Ellery Voss stood in his own bottomland orchard among his smoking oil pots with the reek of burning tar in his throat, watching the smoke settle uselessly along the ground instead of rising. And he knew, with the certainty a man feels in his bones, that by morning his whole crop would be gone. Up on the shelf above the valley, the widow Denning did not light a single smudge pot. She stood on the wooden platform at the foot of her tower in her canvas coat, with her scarf knotted under her chin, and beside her Petey Halloran worked the crank. And at midnight the great radial engine caught and roared and settled into a steady thunder that rolled down off the shelf and across the whole sleeping valley. The bent propeller, straightened and true, bit into the dead cold air and dragged it into a churning wind, and that wind reached up, exactly as the flyer had promised in his letter, up into the warm band of air that lay above the cold like a lid, and it pulled that warmth down and mixed it through the trees, around and around, all through the freezing dark, so that no patch of cold could settle and set on any open flower. Petey looked at her across the platform in the light of the one lantern, and he had to shout over the engine to be heard. "It's holding," he called. "The warm air, it's holding. I can feel it on my face." "Then we keep it turning," she called back, "till the sun comes up over the ridge and does the rest." And they kept it turning. All through the coldest hours of that killing night, while 11 miles of valley went silent and white and dead below them, the widow's engine thundered on its tower, and through its warm churning wind out over 40 acres of blooming apple trees, and Petey fed it fuel and watched the gauges, and Orla stood at the rail with her son's letter over her heart and watched the eastern ridge for the first gray line of the dawn. The whole valley heard it. Far below in his own low fields, standing in the ruin of his orchard among the dying smudge fires, Ellery Voss heard that roaring machine on the hill above him grinding on, hour after hour into the frozen dark, and he did not laugh. He stood in the cold, and he listened to it, and something in the sound of it, steady and stubborn and unafraid, made his patient smiling face go slack and old. The sun came up over the ridge a little after 5, and the widow gave the word, and Petey throttled the great engine down, and it coughed and fell silent, and the sudden quiet lay over the shelf like a held breath. And when the light came full and gold across the valley, the whole county came out into a morning of ruin. In every orchard on the valley floor, the open blossoms hung black and dead on the branch, blasted by the frost, mile on mile of blackened bloom, the best apple year in a decade killed dead in a single clear, cold night. Ellery Voss walked his own rows in that gold light and touched the black flowers and let them crumble in his fingers, and there was not one living blossom in all his acres. And then he looked up. Up on the shelf above the valley, where the widow's tower stood dark against the morning sky, 40 acres of apple trees stood in full and living bloom, white and pink and humming. Every flower open to the sun, the only living orchard for 11 miles in any direction. The warm, churning wind had held the frost off all night long, and the killing cold that had murdered the whole valley had broken and slid away around the widow's shelf and touched not one flower of hers. Ellery Voss stood in the black wreck of his own crop and looked up across the fence line at that hillside of living bloom, and the sight of it took the last of the smile off his face for good. There is no scene in this story where Orla Denning came down off her shelf and stood in the feed store and told the men what they could do with their smudge pots. That was not the shape of her. She had never once gone soft in the head, and she would not go hard in the heart now that she was proved right. She fed Petey Halloran a breakfast of eggs and fried apples that morning in her warm kitchen while the valley mourned below, and she wrote in the oilcloth book the hour the engine started and stopped, and the temperature at the tower and down on the valley floor, 11 degrees of difference between them, and she underlined that number twice, and that was the whole of her celebration. It was Ellery Voss's own grandson who crossed the fence first. The boy was perhaps 19, and he came up the county road on foot 3 days after the frost, when the shape of the disaster had settled over the valley for good, and the whole county understood that the windmill widow had brought a full crop through a night that had killed everyone else's. He came up the road and through her gate, and he stood at the edge of the orchard with his hat held against his chest, looking up at the tower, and when she came out to him he could hardly get the words out. "My grandfather didn't send me," the boy said. "He doesn't know I'm here. I came to ask if you'd teach me how it works. The machine, the wind. I came to ask if you'd show me." And Orla Denning looked at that boy a long moment, at the hat crushed against his chest, and the shame and the wanting in his young face, and she thought of her own son in the cold high sky, riding home, about the warm air that sat above the frost, and she did not send the boy away. "Come up on the platform, then," she said. "It isn't a secret. It never was." She climbed the ladder ahead of him with her gloved hand steady on the cold rail, and at the top she laid her palm on the greasy hub of the great engine and turned and looked out over her living orchard and the dead valley below it. On the still nights, the killing nights, the warm air lies up above the cold like a lid on a pot, she told him. My boy learned that in the sky, and he wrote it home to me. All this machine does is reach up and pull that warm air down and stir it through the trees so the frost can't settle. That's the whole of it. "That's all?" the boy said. "Just wind?" "Just wind on a night there wasn't any," she said. "It was written down in a letter for 2 years, plain as day. Most folks just never had the patience to read it. The public apology came later at the feed store from Ellery Voss himself, who stood one morning among the men who had laughed with him and said, in front of all of them, "I was a fool. I was a fool for 2 full years, and that widow on the shelf knew a truer thing about the cold than any orchard man in this valley." He said it plain and did not soften it, and then he went up to her fence, an old, heavy, humbled man, and asked her, as a neighbor, if she would look at his ruined trees and tell him what a machine like hers would cost, and whether it was too late for him to learn the reading of the air. And she went. She walked his rows with him in her canvas coat and told him what she knew. And she did not once mention the 30 years he had wanted her ground. By the following spring there were 4 such towers standing over the orchards of the Kettle Valley, and within 5 years there were more than a dozen, each one built off the widow's plans, each one throwing its warm, churning wind out over the trees on the killing nights, and the county that had laughed at the windmill widow came, one truck at a time, to build the same fool machine in their own orchards. A man from the State Agricultural College drove up the valley in the summer of 1949 to see the thing for himself, and he sat at the widow's kitchen table and read her oilcloth ledger cover to cover, all her temperatures and her wind and her hours, 2 full years of them. And he told her it was the finest record of orchard frost protection he had ever seen kept by anyone anywhere. He wrote it up in a paper for the college, the practice of stirring the inversion layer over blooming fruit trees with a powered fan on a tower, and though he gave it a long scientific name, he named the widow in it too, by her own name, Orla Denning of Ashford County. And he wrote that the method had come to the valley from a letter sent home by a flyer who had learned the shape of the cold air from the seat of a bomber and had not lived to see his mother put it to use. She kept the orchard until she was too old to climb the platform, and then she gave it, trees and tower and oilcloth ledger and all, to Petey Halloran, who had married and had children by then and had never once let anyone forget who had hired him when no one else would. And every spring, on the clear, cold nights when the wind died and the stars came out hard and the frost came sinking down over the Kettle Valley, the towers all up and down the shelf and the bottom land would catch and roar together in the dark. A dozen dead bombers' engines thundering their warm wind up into the frozen sky, and the apple trees came through the killing nights in full, living bloom, all up and down a valley that had once laughed at a widow with a letter in her pocket and a bent propeller on a stick. The dead flyer's letter she kept to the end of her days, folded into the breast pocket of that canvas coat, close against her heart, and the reading of the cold air that her boy had learned in the sky and could not use himself lived on down in the valley he had never come home to. Orchard by orchard, spring by spring, warm wind against the killing frost. There is one of these stories in every county in America, a person that the whole town decided had gone foolish, holding on to some worthless thing everyone else had thrown away, right up until the hard year came and proved them all wrong. If you have ever held on to a thing your whole town told you to let go of, a way of doing that came down to you from someone you loved and lost, then this story was for you. Stay with us and tell us in the comments the name of the county you are listening from tonight.